In a midnight lecture, Dostoevsky's entire philosophy unfolds, and one idea changes everything. Picture this. It's past midnight, and somewhere in a dimly lit lecture hall, a professor stands before an empty classroom. But this isn't just any lecture. Tonight, he's about to reveal the complete philosophical universe of a man who saw deeper into the human soul than anyone before or since. A man who predicted the rise of totalitarian regimes decades before they emerged, who mapped the unconscious mind before Freud, who defined existential anxiety before the existentialists even existed. Fyodor Dostoevsky wasn't just a novelist. He was a prophet, a psychologist, and a revolutionary thinker who anticipated the greatest discoveries about human nature that the 20th century would produce. What you're about to discover isn't just literature or philosophy. It's a complete blueprint for understanding why human beings act the way they do, why civilizations rise and fall, and why the struggle between good and evil never ends. This midnight lecture will change how you see yourself, your relationships, and the world around you. Because buried in Dostoevsky's novels and stories are the most profound insights into human existence ever written. And at the center of it all is one idea so disturbing, so revolutionary, that it explains everything from personal anxiety to political tyranny to the deepest spiritual questions that have haunted humanity since the beginning of time. Tonight, you'll discover why this Russian genius understood you better than you understand yourself. The cold gray streets of 19th century St. Petersburg witnessed something extraordinary. A man walked among them who would change how humanity understands itself forever. But Dostoevsky's insights didn't come from books or theories. They came from living through some of the most traumatic experiences imaginable. Picture this. You're a young man, arrested for revolutionary activities, sentenced to death by firing squad. You stand blindfolded, waiting for the bullets to end your life. At the last possible moment, a messenger arrives with news that your sentence has been commuted to hard labor in Siberia. You spend the next 4 years in a brutal prison camp, witnessing the absolute depths of human cruelty and degradation. This is what happened to Dostoevsky, and this experience gave his philosophical insights a power that purely academic philosophers could never achieve. He didn't theorize about human nature from an ivory tower. He studied it in the darkest places where masks fall away and people reveal who they really are. But here's what makes Dostoevsky truly extraordinary. While he witnessed unimaginable suffering and cruelty, he also observed something that challenged everything the intellectuals of his time believed about human nature. He saw hardened criminals risk their lives to help fellow prisoners. He witnessed acts of kindness that had no rational explanation. He experienced moments when the barriers between self and other seemed to dissolve, and he felt connected to all suffering humanity. What Dostoevsky discovered in that prison camp was this: human beings are far more complex, contradictory, and mysterious than any philosophical or scientific theory could explain. We're not rational creatures who make logical decisions based on self-interest. We're not blank slates, shaped entirely by our environment. We're not even consistent from one moment to the next. We are creatures capable of both extraordinary goodness and unthinkable evil. We can sacrifice ourselves for others and then destroy those we claim to love. We can understand exactly what we should do to improve our lives and then choose to do the opposite. We can create beautiful art and literature while living in complete moral chaos. This insight led Dostoevsky to a revolutionary understanding that anticipated every major psychological discovery of the next century. Decades before Freud, he understood that human behavior is driven by unconscious forces that operate below the level of awareness. Years before existentialists declared that existence precedes essence, Dostoevsky had dramatized this truth through unforgettable characters. Long before totalitarian regimes arose to terrorize the world, Dostoevsky had predicted exactly how they would operate and why they would appeal to millions of people. He saw that the greatest threats to human freedom would come not from traditional tyrants, but from educated idealists who believed they were serving humanity. But Dostoevsky's most disturbing insight was still to come. The insight that explains everything. Most people think freedom is something we naturally want and cherish. The ability to make our own choices, to live without interference, to determine our own destiny. But Dostoevsky discovered something that shattered this comfortable assumption. Something so disturbing that it explains why people voluntarily surrender their autonomy to dictators, why intelligent individuals make self-destructive choices, and why the promise of security often triumphs over the call of liberty. Dostoevsky realized that most human beings cannot handle genuine freedom, not because they're weak or ignorant, but because freedom is the most terrifying burden a conscious being can bear. Think about what real freedom actually means. It's not just the ability to choose what you want. It's the inescapable responsibility of choosing who you want to become. Every moment, every decision, every thought and action shapes your identity and affects others. You cannot escape this responsibility even if you try. Even when you surrender your freedom to authority figures or rigid ideologies, you're still making a free choice to surrender. This creates what Dostoevsky called the fundamental tragedy of human existence. The very thing that makes us human, our capacity for free choice, is the thing that most of us desperately want to escape. We want to be free, but we don't want the responsibility that comes with freedom. We want to make choices, but we don't want to face the consequences of our choices. Dostoevsky illustrated this through his most important character, the underground man. This is a former government clerk who has withdrawn from society and spends his time writing bitter notes about human existence. He's highly intelligent, deeply self-aware, and completely miserable. He understands exactly what he should do to improve his life, but he refuses to do it. Why does he sabotage his own happiness? Because it's the only way he can assert his freedom. By choosing to be miserable, he proves that he's not a machine programmed for happiness. The underground man would rather suffer as a free being than be happy as a slave. This is the essence of human perversity that Dostoevsky discovered. We will choose suffering over happiness if suffering is the only way to prove our autonomy. We will act against our own interests simply to demonstrate that we are not predictable. We will embrace irrationality as a form of rebellion against any system that tries to reduce us to logical formulas. This insight explains so much about human behavior that seems otherwise inexplicable. Why do people stay in toxic relationships? Sometimes because leaving would mean admitting they made a mistake in choosing that person. Why do individuals reject good advice from family and friends? Often because accepting help would mean acknowledging their dependence on others. Why do societies sometimes choose leaders who promise to make their lives worse rather than better? Because the promise of shared suffering can feel more authentic than the promise of artificial happiness. But here's where Dostoevsky's insight becomes truly prophetic. He realized that this human tendency to flee from freedom would create unprecedented opportunities for a new kind of tyranny. Traditional dictators ruled through fear and force, but the tyrants of the future would rule by offering people exactly what they unconsciously wanted: relief from the burden of having to choose for themselves. The underground man represents more than just individual psychological dysfunction. He's a prophecy of what human consciousness would become in the modern world. He is the first fully self-aware neurotic in literature, a man whose intelligence has become his curse and whose self-consciousness has paralyzed him completely. When you understand the underground man, you understand the psychological condition of millions of people living today. He is sick with excessive self-awareness. He is spiteful because his intelligence has revealed what he sees as the futility of human existence. He's socially awkward because his hyperactive mind has made him incapable of natural, spontaneous human connection. The underground man's fundamental problem is that he thinks too much. In earlier ages, people could act on instinct, tradition, or religious faith without endless self-questioning. But the underground man has been exposed to modern education, scientific thinking, and philosophical skepticism. He cannot accept anything on faith. He cannot act on impulse without analyzing his motives. This excessive consciousness creates a terrible problem for action. The underground man knows exactly what he should do to improve his life. But knowing and doing are two completely different things. He should exercise, but he analyzes his motives for exercise until the impulse dies. He should socialize, but he anticipates every possible social embarrassment until he talks himself out of leaving his apartment. Intelligence, which should be humanity's greatest gift, has become his greatest curse. But the problem goes deeper than mere overthinking. He has lost the ability to feel genuine emotions. Everything he experiences is filtered through multiple layers of self-consciousness until the original feeling is completely distorted. This creates a fundamental alienation from his own inner life. The underground man feels like a stranger to himself. He watches his own thoughts and feelings as if they belong to someone else. This internal division makes authentic self-expression impossible. Dostoevsky understood that this condition was becoming the defining characteristic of modern consciousness. We live in our heads, constantly analyzing, comparing, and judging our own experiences instead of simply living them. We've become spectators of our own lives, so focused on managing our image and controlling outcomes that we've lost the capacity for spontaneous joy, authentic emotion, and genuine connection. This is why anxiety and depression have become epidemics in prosperous, educated societies. It's not that life has become objectively worse, but that modern consciousness has become trapped in patterns of self-awareness that make natural happiness almost impossible. The underground man shows us what happens when human intelligence becomes disconnected from wisdom, when self-awareness becomes separated from self-acceptance, and when freedom becomes divorced from purpose. He is modern man in all his sophisticated misery, brilliant enough to see through every illusion, but too paralyzed by his insights to create anything meaningful. But Dostoevsky didn't stop with this diagnosis. Through other characters, he showed us what consciousness looks like when it's channeled toward love rather than mere analysis, when intelligence serves wisdom rather than just cleverness, and when self-awareness leads to compassion rather than isolation. Yet the underground man remains one of the most important characters in all of literature because he represents the shadow side of human development that we ignore at our peril. He shows us what we become when we gain consciousness but lose our souls, when we acquire knowledge but forfeit meaning, when we achieve sophistication but sacrifice authenticity. In the darkness of his underground room, writing his bitter notes, the underground man holds up a mirror to modern civilization. And what we see reflected there is both disturbing and undeniably true. But Dostoevsky's most devastating philosophical challenge was yet to come. Through the character of Ivan Karamazov, he would present the strongest case against God's existence ever written, not through scientific arguments or logical proofs, but through something far more powerful, a moral argument that strikes at the very heart of religious faith. Ivan Karamazov is a brilliant intellectual who has studied philosophy, theology, and history. He understands all the traditional arguments for God's existence and the standard explanations for why a good God permits evil. But he has also collected stories of innocent children being tortured and murdered by adults. And when confronted with the reality of this suffering, all theological explanations collapse into meaninglessness. Ivan tells his brother about a 5-year-old girl whose parents tortured her for minor infractions. They would beat her, lock her in an outhouse overnight in freezing cold, and force her to eat her own excrement. The child would pray to God for protection, but no protection came. Eventually, her parents tortured her to death. Ivan asks a simple but devastating question. Can you understand why a little creature who cannot even understand what is being done to her should beat her little heart with her tiny fist in the dark and cold, weeping tears to God for protection? And what can we say about a God who hears such prayers and does nothing? The standard religious response is to say that God works in mysterious ways that human beings cannot understand. Perhaps the suffering serves some greater purpose that will be revealed in the afterlife. But Ivan rejects all such explanations as morally obscene. No greater good could possibly justify the torture of innocent children. No eternal compensation could make up for undeserved agony. If the achievement of some cosmic harmony requires even one child to suffer unjustly, then Ivan wants nothing to do with such harmony. He refuses to participate in any cosmic plan that is built on the foundation of innocent suffering. Even if he could be shown that all suffering will eventually be justified, he would still reject his ticket to such a universe. Ivan's rebellion culminates in his famous parable of the Grand Inquisitor. In this story, Jesus returns to Earth during the Spanish Inquisition and begins performing miracles. The Grand Inquisitor, representing the highest authority of the Catholic Church, has Jesus arrested and visits him in prison to explain why the Church must reject and execute him. The problem, according to the Inquisitor, is that Jesus offered humanity freedom. But freedom is a burden that most people cannot bear. They don't want the responsibility of making their own moral and spiritual choices. They want security, certainty, and relief from the terrible burden of having to think and choose for themselves. The Church has corrected Jesus' mistake by giving people exactly what they actually want rather than what Jesus thought they should want. Instead of demanding that people exercise their freedom to choose between good and evil, the Church has made the choice for them. The result is a humanity that is much happier and more peaceful than it would have been under Jesus' original plan. The Inquisitor supports his argument by reinterpreting the three temptations that Satan offered Jesus in the wilderness. Satan offered to turn stones into bread, representing the promise to solve material need. Jesus rejected this, but the Inquisitor points out that most people are primarily concerned with their physical survival. A truly loving God would have chosen to feed people rather than preserving their spiritual freedom. Satan also offered Jesus the chance to prove his divinity through an undeniable miracle. Jesus rejected this as well, insisting that faith must be freely chosen. But the Inquisitor argues that most people desperately want certainty and are tormented by doubt. A truly compassionate God would have provided clear evidence that would eliminate all uncertainty. Finally, Satan offered Jesus dominion over all earthly kingdoms, representing the power to create perfect political institutions. Jesus rejected this too, insisting that his kingdom was not of this world. But the Inquisitor argues that most people need strong leadership and clear social order. A truly wise God would have taken political power and used it to create conditions under which all people could live in peace. The Grand Inquisitor concludes that Satan understood human nature better than Jesus did. The Church has embraced Satan's gifts and used them to create a system that makes the vast majority of humanity much happier than they would have been under Jesus' plan. This argument is terrifying because it contains enough truth to be plausible. How many people really want the responsibility of making their own moral choices? How many would rather have economic security than freedom? How many would choose certainty over truth if the two conflicted? Dostoevsky wrote this parable decades before the rise of fascism and communism, but it perfectly describes the appeal of totalitarian movements. Both fascist and communist regimes offered exactly what the Grand Inquisitor promised: economic security through state control, certainty through official ideology, and strong leadership that would relieve ordinary people of political responsibility. The parable explains why democratic societies are always fragile and why freedom is always in danger. Democracy requires citizens to educate themselves, make difficult choices, and accept responsibility for consequences. This is hard work that many people would rather avoid. But Dostoevsky doesn't end the parable with the Inquisitor's argument. After listening silently to the entire monologue, Jesus responds not with words but with a simple action. He gently kisses the old Inquisitor on his aged lips. This kiss contains no argument, no refutation, no explanation. It is simply an expression of love for a human being who has lost his way. The Inquisitor is deeply moved by this gesture, but he does not change his mind. He releases Jesus and tells him never to return. This ending suggests that the choice between freedom and security cannot be resolved through rational argument. It comes down to a fundamental decision about what human beings are and what they are capable of becoming. This is the eternal struggle that Dostoevsky identified at the heart of human existence. We are caught between our longing for security and our need for meaning, between our desire for certainty and our capacity for growth, between our fear of responsibility and our hunger for authentic life. Yet in the face of all this darkness, all this suffering, all this seemingly insurmountable complexity of human existence, Dostoevsky discovered something that changes everything. Something that transforms suffering from meaningless tragedy into the very foundation of spiritual growth. Something that turns the struggle between faith and doubt from an intellectual problem into a pathway to ultimate reality. That something is love. Not the sentimental emotion celebrated in popular culture, but love as the fundamental force that holds the universe together, the ultimate reality behind all appearances, the final answer to every philosophical question. For Dostoevsky, love in this ultimate sense is identical with God, and the capacity for such love is what makes human beings capable of redemption, no matter how far they have fallen or how much they have suffered. This understanding of love emerged from Dostoevsky's own experience of suffering and spiritual transformation. In the Siberian prison camp, he witnessed not only the worst aspects of human nature, but also moments of unexpected compassion and self-sacrifice. These experiences convinced him that beneath the surface of human cruelty and selfishness lay a deeper reality of universal love that could transform even the most degraded souls. But Dostoevsky's concept of love was paradoxical and often difficult to understand. True love, he believed, could only emerge through the complete acceptance of suffering. Those who tried to avoid pain, either for themselves or others, could never develop the spiritual depth necessary for genuine love. This means that love often appears as its opposite, manifesting as tragedy, loss, and heartbreak rather than joy and fulfillment. Prince Myshkin in The Idiot represents pure, innocent love that seeks nothing for itself and gives everything to others. But Myshkin's love is tragic because it cannot protect him or those he loves from suffering. Yet Dostoevsky suggests that even apparent failure can plant seeds that bear fruit in future generations. Alyosha Karamazov represents a more mature form of love that has learned to work within the limitations of human nature. He responds to each person with specific acts of compassion appropriate to their circumstances. He listens without judging, forgives without conditions, and helps without expecting recognition. His love is quiet but transformative. The contrast between these loving characters and those who lack love reveals the central tragedy of human existence. Characters like Raskolnikov and Ivan Karamazov are capable of brilliant analysis and profound sensitivity, but they are trapped in their own subjectivity and cannot break through to genuine connection with others. Dostoevsky believed that this isolation was the fundamental problem of modern civilization. Rationalism and individualism had taught people to view themselves as separate atoms, competing in an indifferent universe. This worldview made genuine love almost impossible because it assumed that self-interest and altruism were fundamentally opposed. The alternative was what Dostoevsky called spiritual unity achieved through love. When people experience this unity, they discover that their deepest interests are not separate from others, but identical with them. They realize that the boundaries between self and other are illusions, and that true fulfillment comes through self-transcendence rather than self-assertion. Father Zosima in The Brothers Karamazov embodies this ideal and teaches that every human being is responsible for everyone else. When one person sins, all humanity is diminished. When one person is redeemed, all humanity is lifted up. This interconnectedness becomes visible to those who have learned to love truly. But Dostoevsky was too honest to present love as an easy solution. True love requires enormous sacrifice and often leads to apparent failure. Those who love most deeply often suffer most intensely because they open themselves to the pain of others. Love does not eliminate evil or prevent tragedy. It transforms the meaning of evil and tragedy by placing them in the context of ultimate redemption. The ultimate test of love, according to Dostoevsky, is forgiveness. Anyone can love those who are kind and deserving, but only those transformed by grace can love their enemies, forgive those who have hurt them, and see the divine image in those who appear completely evil. This kind of forgiveness represents a spiritual recognition that all human beings share the same fundamental nature despite surface differences. Those who achieve this level of spiritual development become channels through which divine love can enter the world and transform it. Dostoevsky believed that the capacity for such love was the ultimate mark of human dignity and the final answer to all questions about the meaning and purpose of existence. Those who achieved this spiritual development could not eliminate suffering or solve all problems, but they could change the atmosphere in which those problems existed. Through their presence and example, the impossible became possible, and the kingdom of heaven became present even in the midst of earthly hell. This is Dostoevsky's ultimate message, that no matter how dark the world becomes, no matter how much we suffer, no matter how lost we feel, the possibility of redemption through love always remains. The choice that Dostoevsky presents to humanity remains as relevant today as it was in 19th century Russia. We can choose the path of the Grand Inquisitor, seeking security at the cost of our humanity. We can choose Ivan's path, demanding that reality conform to our expectations. We can choose the underground man's path, retreating into isolation. Or we can choose the path of love, accepting the burden of freedom while trusting in the possibility of redemption. This choice determines not only our individual fate, but the fate of human civilization itself. In our current moment, when traditional sources of meaning continue to weaken while new forms of control threaten human freedom, Dostoevsky's insights are more essential than ever. His warnings about utopian thinking speak to contemporary movements that promise to solve all problems through correct theories. His understanding of psychological manipulation anticipates sophisticated forms of modern propaganda. The final message of Dostoevsky's philosophy is both challenging and encouraging. Challenging because it demands that we abandon comfortable illusions and face existence's full complexity. Challenging because it requires taking responsibility without the security of absolute certainty. But encouraging because it demonstrates that humans can rise above their limitations to achieve consciousness that justifies existence's struggle. Life's meaning is found not in the absence of suffering, but in suffering's transformation into love. Freedom is not the elimination of constraints, but the conscious choice to serve something greater than ourselves. Faith is not the absence of doubt, but the decision to trust in ultimate meaning despite contradictory evidence. This midnight lecture ends where it began, with the recognition that Dostoevsky saw deeper into the human soul than anyone before or since. His legacy challenges us to face reality without illusion while maintaining hope without naivety, to love without conditions while accepting responsibility without excuses. This is perhaps the most difficult path humans can walk, but it is also the only path that leads to genuine fulfillment and authentic meaning. Those who choose this path join a communion of souls that transcends time, united by their commitment to truth, love, and the endless struggle to become more fully human. This is Dostoevsky's ultimate gift, not easy answers, but a vision of what we can become when we choose to live with courage, honesty, and love in the face of life's eternal mysteries.